Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Trinity College. It's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Fellows of the College. My name is Hilary Boulding, and I'm the President of the College. This is part of our public events series, and today we're welcoming Judge Theodor Meron in conversation with Baroness Helena Kennedy. Through his work in the field of international criminal justice and humanitarian law, Judge Meron is one of the most celebrated legal figures in recent times, celebrated for his accomplishments in the field of international criminal justice, for his humanity, which is a shining beacon against the backdrop of some of the bleakest chapters in human history, and for his lifelong focus on making the world a better and a more just place. Judge Meron is an honorary visiting fellow at Trinity, known to all as Ted. He's been an almost constant presence in Trinity in recent years, and our small community has been the beneficiary. He's committed to teaching and expanding the knowledge and horizons of experienced academics, government officials, diplomats and decision makers. He's also unfailingly generous with students, sharing his experience, answering questions of law, and helping them to understand the human and sometimes lonely position of weighing evidence and applying the law. In 2020, Judge Meron was conferred with the award of Honorary Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George in recognition of his work in the field of international criminal justice. The award is to an order of chivalry, and it seems particularly fitting for a person whose love is Shakespeare and who's written in particular about war and chivalry in Shakespeare. In his book on the subject, Ted writes, "Shakespeare's work contains a plethora of fascinating texts illuminating chivalry and the humanitarian ideal. Perhaps more than anything else, chivalry meant the duty to act honorably, even in war." He frequently expresses his surprise at the turns his life has taken, not least in being appointed an international criminal judge at the age of 71. In his book, Standing Up for Justice, Ted writes, "Here I was, a person who had missed a normal education, a survivor of the Holocaust, judging war crimes, something I was committed to doing fairly, justly, and without favor or fear." He's in conversation with Baroness Kennedy of the Shores. Baroness Kennedy is one of the country's most distinguished lawyers. She's a member of the Bar, a King's Counsel, a bencher of Gray's Inn, an honorary writer to the Signet, and the recipient of no fewer than 42 honorary degrees in recognition of her work on women and the law and on widening participation in higher education. Baroness Kennedy was created a life peer in 1997 and has been a strong advocate in the House of Lords for social justice and the rule of law. In 2024, she was appointed to the Order of the Thistle, the greatest order of chivalry in Scotland, in recognition of the importance of her pioneering work in advancing human rights and social justice. In 2021, when Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, Baroness Kennedy was instrumental in evacuating 102 women judges and prosecutors who were on death lists. She raised funds, secured safe houses, chartered planes, and resettled the women around the world. She's currently working for the President of Ukraine on war crimes and trying to recover the thousands of children who've been abducted from Ukraine by Russian forces. Welcome to both of them. They're going to talk together and eventually open up for some questions from the audience, and the whole evening will take about 55 minutes. Thank you very much. Please welcome them.
Helena, I suspect you have a world record of honorary degrees.
I don't know about that.
42, unbelievable.
No, the thing that I'm really proud of is that I'm a fellow of 5 Royal Colleges of Medicine, and my husband, who is a surgeon, is deeply jealous about that fact, that he had to work for his medical degrees. Anyway, it's lovely to be honoured, and you have received many honours too, and my honour is being here with you tonight, Ted Meron.
Come on.
Yes, no. I always say, we recently worked together on a particular piece of work for the International Criminal Court, and I say this all the time, Ted, I say it was like being in a master class, being at the foot of this great man. No, being there. There were 6 of us as lawyers, British lawyers, and we were working with Ted, and it was hard because it was we knew that we would be under enormous pressure, and therefore we had to measure whether there was the threshold was met for the issuing of warrants, and it was a very, very demanding and difficult task. And you really were the leader of the pack, and you were so brilliant. And we all felt the honour of being with you. But we became great friends. And I have to tell you that I have had the privilege of receiving the manuscript of his memoir. And so I'm going to take you through some of the chapters of it tonight. I couldn't take you through all of it. But this man has led, I mean, cats have 9 lives. But you've had about 9 lives too. I mean, you really have had such a different and varied life. But I want to start with the beginning, because I think it has informed all the decisions you've made in your life and the roles you've played, and how you've done so with such moral courage and with such principle. So I wanted to start with the whole business of where you came from. You were born in Poland. Your family sounded lovely. Your parents sounded like fine people. You had lovely uncles and aunts. And you had a delightful brother whom you admired, and you were the little one and he was the big one. And reading those chapters of your early life, and then the whole trauma of war, of invasion, of your border town in Poland by the Nazis, and the recognition that that was going to change life, and then having to flee for your lives in the face of that terrible challenge. I mean, you were only 9. Were you terrified? Were you conscious that the adults were in a great state of anguish?
Yes, I mean, age of 9 is you are almost an adult. And the fear of Germans, the rumors of what was happening in Germany to Jews, the fact that the city where I was born was very close to the border of Germany, that it took only 3 days for the Wehrmacht to occupy that city. But it also gave me a sense very early on that focused it was on killing Jews, the German killing machine, also aimed at others. And I read about, I didn't know this at the time, but I discovered that the very first action that the Germans took in the city where I was born is to collect the Polish Catholic intellectuals and kill them.
So Polish Catholic intellectuals were at the receiving end too, because they were analysing and critical of what was going on over the border in Germany.
Or they would have been also, I think, a target, because Germany realized that this was the officer corps, the intellectuals, the academics,
would be leading
the resistance. Mm-hmm. And of course, that was true. Mm-hmm. And they tried to eliminate as many of them as they could.
I mean, one of the things that becomes very clear in your memoir is that even from being a little boy, you were conscious of the fact that there was really a direction of travel, which was that Jewish people were suffering at the hands of the Nazis. But you always make reference to the fact that there were others too, the Roma, that people who were homosexual, that so many other groups were also being included in it, but not 6 million. I mean, that's the shocking business of the Holocaust. And I wanted...
Not 6 million.
Your father was quite an entrepreneurial person, and he ran a business and so on. And he managed to get hold of a cart and a horse. A horse.
Which he has never driven in his life.
Never had managed to have anything to do with horses before. But you piled on the things and so on to get out of town. But then the bombardment and overnight, when you were sleeping on the side of the road, the horse ended up getting killed, and you had to end up all carrying your own baggage. 9 years old or not, you were carrying basically your own clothes and so on into the wilderness.
Well, it was not the most pleasant part of my life.
And lines, I mean, we've watched the business in Gaza of lines of people moving to different places and recently moving back into their place. But you were on roads packed with people like that, carrying their baggage and moving from A to B, from B to C, and being bombarded at that time. And I just wanted to ask you about, I'm not going to say what, but you're a great age now. Do you feel, is it a disappointment to see that the world has not improved and learned the lessons that might have been learned?
Very much so. Very much so. And when I see what is happening, not just in Gaza, but in South Sudan, for example, in Congo, in Burma, we are not doing well in terms of realizing that we should treat our neighbors in the largest sense of the word as someone whom we should respect and protect and love. And you spoke about the people in Gaza. To see the rubble into which cities have been turned is very, very painful. It's even worse than the destruction in Poland in 1939.
I want to go back to that experience for you as a child, because you really, I mean, you were thrown almost into adulthood because you were 9 and you were having to look after yourself, you were having to find food, you were having to, and you talk about your intrigue with forests because you at times had to hide
Forests and the rivers.
Yes, forests and rivers became obsessional interest for you because they became so much part of that terrible journey. But you ended up in the Warsaw Ghetto.
No, it was not Warsaw.
The small ghetto? Częstochowa. And there was a labour camp and so on. I mean, it's important for people to know what you as a child, there was no school, there was none of that. You weren't allowed to go to school even before you went on the road with your family. But what happened?
One thing which I found difficult, extremely difficult, more difficult than the material things, that I could no longer go to school, see people my age, play with them.
The loneliness, the solitariness.
The solitary nature of being only with adults. And I, of course, you were constantly afraid. So in the beginning, I found solace in very long walks. When things became worse and I was in a labor camp, one of the things that helped me with sort of light at the end of the tunnel was daydreaming. And I was reflecting on that recently and said how much that actually helped me. Thinking of silly things, trivial things, but things which were so great before the war. Kayaking, biking, long walks, etc.
The lost pleasures of childhood.
All the pleasures of childhood which have completely disappeared. And the rest was, in a way, a very strong instinct of survival and a lot of luck.
Your older brother was how much older than you?
5 years.
Yeah, and he was having to be much more of an adult, and so he wasn't around. I mean, he wasn't there to play or be with you.
I was ignored by him almost completely.
That's big brothers for you. But you, I mean, there's the terrible story of the business of where people, you had to basically survive. And so that meant that, for example, people in the Jewish community, when you were in this area where you were having to live, they decided that they wanted to do a tunnel, create a tunnel that went out under, I think the river actually, wasn't it? Or it was
No, just
out under to get
barbed wires.
There was barbed wires and under a tunnel to remove, and then it was discovered, and you weren't at home on the day of the discovery of the tunnel by the Nazis. But tell everyone what happened when you came home.
Well, I think that there was first instance of a large ghetto. Then people were deported, sent to Treblinka, and a very small number survived. And I was mostly in the hiding and smuggled into a small ghetto where the survivors lived. And we lived very close to the border of the ghetto.
Your uncle Felix was a great character. I mean, he seems to have been your younger uncle, and he was the one who was full of ideas and was prepared to, do things to try and save the family.
He tried to save the family by becoming a member of the Jewish police, which more or less complex.
Well,
But nevertheless, he saved the family. And one day, at night actually, a number of people came to our house, which was on the borderline, and with guns, and said, we are going to dig a tunnel there. And we were not thrilled.
It was a resistance movement.
It was a resistance movement. They said, we need a tunnel one day for people to escape when the small ghetto is being liquidated. And we need this as a channel for getting arms to the extent possible from Polish resistance. So they were coming every night and digging, and they did not ask for permission, of course. And
well, maybe Hamas didn't ask for permission in Gaza either, but
We realized the danger, and I had a small job in the Jewish community, and that particular day, I was about 15 or 30 minutes late returning home. And when I went, quote unquote, home, I realized that the area was surrounded by German paratroopers, that people from our house were evacuated, that they captured some of the resistance, Jewish resistance people who were
making the tunnel,
who were identified somehow, probably somebody denounced them, and they were hanged in the very area. And my mother was at home, and my maternal grandparents, and they were put on trucks and sent outside of the city and machine gunned. And it was somewhat ironic that the place of execution was in quarries, which before the Second World War were managed by my maternal grandfather, who was killed there. And the following day, there was the so-called selection, and for reasons I will never understand, they found me grown up enough to be sent to a labor camp. And in a way, I survived the war, doing something which I would not recommend. I was involved in German war effort. The factory where I was producing ammunition for the Wehrmacht. But
your father also, your mother was shot. Your grandparents were shot. Where was your brother?
My brother was, when I was in hiding when the large ghetto was being liquidated, because it was obvious that I would not be considered old enough as working labor and material He went to with the selection to be.
He was taken off to be work in a labour camp?
Well, no, he was taken for a place of selection, and then, crazy in a way as he was, he attacked the German officer because he wanted to be killed there. But the Germans understood the point, so they did not kill him. They put him on a train to Treblinka, and subsequently we heard that he was in Treblinka. He was in a labor group. He survived, and he participated in the famous uprising there, which put an end to Treblinka. So
he didn't survive that.
He did not survive. We never know what happened to him. He could have been killed by somebody in the forest too.
Yeah. So you and your father were the two who really survived to the end of the war.
Correct.
And you describe so poignantly in the book the sudden fall of silence when the bombardments and the sound of the military presence suddenly went quiet, and a sense that somehow it was over. And you went. Then, I mean, your father wanted to go back to your own city, your own town, your own place where he had a business and so on, and he wanted to make a go of it, but you hated it.
I felt that I did not belong, and he wanted to give it a try. So I managed to be smuggled out of Poland by a British, the famous Jewish brigade from Palestine.
The Jewish brigade, yeah.
And he stayed on and came to Palestine just a few years later.
After you. Because you had an aunt in Palestine who was a very accomplished woman, and she and her husband became your sort of replacement parents in many ways.
Yes, she did really wonders for me, because at that time, I was 15, nearly 16, and the question is, what do you do at this age when since the age of 9 you have not been to school?
No education at all.
No education, not only that, during the war I could not get books or read.
And you were going to a country where the languages were Hebrew and...
which I did not know a word of.
And
English
again,
same
and you didn't
thing.
know. And so you were a Polish speaker, and you had to suddenly, at the rate of knots, you had to learn new languages, start studying, trying to make up for lost time.
Yes, it was my aunt, who was a very, very persuasive woman. The very first female graduate of the famous Technion, Technical University in Haifa, who became a full professor and eventually a rector, went to see the director of high school nearby. And he said, well, I really don't know what to tell you, but if by September next year he will know enough Hebrew, enough English, enough mathematics,
enough of the
geometry,
and all of that,
then I will take him.
And you went to work like a demon.
Oh, it was horrible.
It was horrible.
It was horrible. What was they were well enough to hire coaches for all of these subjects.
So they brought in people to...
They brought people, they came home one after another. I found it completely confusing. And I did not believe I would make it. But in September, they applied a lot of mercy.
I suspect that you might have done better than you suggest that you did.
I don't know.
But you ended up, you went to university, and you were a great student, and you went from there. I mean, let's just track that university career.
Well, I was not a great student in Jerusalem, actually.
How did you end up in Harvard then? I think you set the bar too high, Ted.
No. Actually, because I I had a job in addition to studying, which was quite time-consuming. And I found that the university was very, very conservative in terms of methods of teaching. And there was a tremendous bonus, a great prize given for memory and memorizing
It was pretty,
rules
you felt
of
that it was
procedure. It was
memorizing.
not my cup of tea. I preferred the analytical,
And,
the
and that was the thing that you felt was so different about your experience at Harvard and then at Cambridge, was that it was very different. It was not just stuffing facts into your head.
Exactly,
and remembering
it was
cases.
analytical, but actually the more amazing thing was that Harvard took me. I think that the subject in which I was from the beginning extremely interested was human rights, which at that time was still a very minor subject, but international law. And I wrote a decent paper in one subject, which was international law. And then I asked the professor whether he would recommend me, and he gave me a letter of recommendation. It was reasonably kind. And I sent it, I think, to 8 American universities. 7 rejected me.
But Harvard saw the brilliance that was in that essay.
It was completely crazy, I can assure you, when I got a letter of acceptance from them and a scholarship of $800. Now, that was a fortune at the time, and it was enough to pay the entire tuition at Harvard Law School.
Wow.
Today, you probably would need $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000.
Yes.
But it worked, and Harvard really changed intellectually my life completely.
Yes.
I realized that what matters in life is your reflection on the subject, your analysis of the subject, your own conclusions, and it doesn't really matter whether your conclusion is one which is the accepted one, provided that it's interesting and promising. Harvard will like it.
Yes.
So that was it worked.
And you mentioned that human rights at that time was very much in a very nascent.
Hardly.
I mean, it was hardly in existence at all. We were talking about a period where it might have been the 50s. Are we talking about the 50s?
In Harvard?
Yes.
Yes.
It was in the 50s. And you then
1950.
and you came and also studied at Cambridge, and you met Lauterpacht and all those great sort of leaders in the field of international law and humanitarian law and human rights. And how did you fancy Cambridge? How was that?
Well, I was extremely lucky in Harvard. After the first year, my grades justified a very generous scholarship. So I bought my first jacket in the United States. Corduroy.
Corduroy, like an Englishman.
Harvard crimson color, of course. And I was lucky to have 2 mentors at Harvard Law School who were among the most really giants of international law. One was Richard Baxter, who later became an American judge in the International Court of Justice. And he was an expert on humanitarian law of war. And I was his research assistant. And the second was, in fact, a refugee from Poland, Louis Son, who was one of the first primarily human rights lawyers. He wrote about it. And Baxter recommended me to Lauterpacht. And I remember one day I received, Lauterpacht was very conscious of not spending his money lavishly.
That's a very nice way of putting it. Okay.
So I remember one day many of you are probably not aware what is an aerogram.
An aerogram?
An aerogram
is... It was like tissue paper. It was...
Sort of, in terms, if you want to touch it. Basically, it is an envelope which comes pre-stamped. It was the cheapest way of sending a letter to somebody because everything was done. And he wrote me a very nice letter saying, you were recommended by Richard Baxter. We would love to have you in Cambridge, and we will pay for your trip by boat, second class. Second class for me was...
Oh, it was heaven.
It was
pretty
heaven,
fancy.
you cannot imagine. They found me a place in Jesus College.
Mm-hmm.
And actually I spent most of my time...
And that was the start of your love affair with the United Kingdom. Would that be fair?
Correct?
Yeah.
That's correct.
I'm going to talk
And
to you
my
about...
first article for the American Journal is for the British Yearbook of International Law.
Now, you've had such an incredible life that I'm going to have to sort of cut through some of this. But your scholarship was being recognized and people realized that you were a brilliant lawyer. And you went back to Israel and you joined the diplomatic service. You joined government and you became a very distinguished lawyer in government. And I want to ask you about that because we're seeing a whole load of stuff just now about our own Attorney General and about a criticism of him, about the kind of cases he did in the past and so on, but also criticism about, you know, his advising on law and being very more legal than political. And I just want to tease that out for you because those were challenges that you faced. How does a lawyer advise on matters where you know that, that sticking to the law is not going to appeal to those who you are giving advice to?
Well, looking back at that period, actually, what I find interesting was the fact that the idea that I would be doing something which those who have requested an opinion from me would not like. That this would not be the opinion that they would have chosen or they would have liked me to write. It was not a factor at all.
It wasn't a factor?
Not a factor at all.
You didn't let it...
No.
You didn't have sleepless nights tossing, thinking, oh my God, the Prime Minister is going to be furious with me.
The main thing to which you are perhaps alluding is my Palestine opinions.
I wanted to take you to
And I
that.
wrote it, I think, within 2 days, 2 or 3 pages. And people asked me, you did not worry about how the ministry will react, etc. First of all, I must say that they reacted quite well, except for ignoring the opinion.
They ignored the... Now, let me explain to everyone what this is about. In 1967, there was the war, and it really is the great sort of shifting moment. Israel had been created in 1948. You were at that time young and a schoolboy, really, and then went to university and then went abroad to study. And then you went back to this new young country. And then it was embroiled in an Arab-Israeli war. And one of the things that you were asked to advise on was the status of territories that had been occupied, it was basically what we call the West Bank today. And you advised that occupation of that area could not be used in order to create settlements for civilians. And you, well, perhaps you would like to describe how the law is in relation to that, because it still applies today. It's the issue of Russia in the occupied territories. It's always the places that are on borders, isn't it? Where there's some argument over who does this belong to, and there is a rule in international law around the occupation of about resettling people there, putting your own people in there. I suppose it happened in Northern Ireland when quite a while back. There was the Protestants were brought to settle in Northern Ireland in order to deal with the whole business of it being a country that was essentially Catholic. And so those border issues and those settlement issues of settling people in a place where they hadn't previously been is an issue of law. Tell us all the law.
Of course, in terms of background, personal background, the fact that I was 37 was quite helpful. When we are young, we believe in the integrity of things, in the purity of things. We do not believe that cosmetic solutions bring solutions at all. By then, we of course had the Geneva Conventions of 1949. We had a famous convention which did not exist during the Second World War. That was the Fourth Geneva Convention, which deals with two questions: civilians and the status of occupations, and imposes serious limitations on the prerogatives, on the rights, privileges of the occupying power. So there was a provision there, and I read the provision. And the provision said no settlements. No settlements. And actually, looking back at that, and later I expanded on that, when I wrote an article for the American Journal on the 50th anniversary of the occupation, I felt already then very, very strongly that we no longer live in a period in which colonization is something acceptable. So I felt that we should not, it's wrong to build civilian settlements, which could be an origin of colonization.
It's interesting
on
because
basically Arab land.
yeah, it's interesting because it was a Labour, it was an Israeli Labour government.
It was not the Likud, it was not the right wing, it was the Labour.
It was a Labour government in Israel that basically ignored your advice and permitted the beginnings of settlement building, and people making their homes there on Arab land.
And my opinions remained, in fact, secret until I think 2006.
Yes, I mean, because you gave that advice, it was privileged advice, so it went into the archives. You didn't talk about it, they didn't talk about it, but it was discovered in the, I mean, what, about 15 years ago?
It was discovered in 2006.
Yeah.
Previously, 2005, by an Israeli journalist, Tom Seger, and subsequently by an American Jew historian by the name of Gorenberg,
yeah.
who was allowed to into the archives. And he came across this opinion, and apparently the first thing he did was, how clever of him, he took out a camera and
took a photograph of it.
Photographed it. And subsequently, he asked for a copy, and I asked for a copy. Nothing doing. We never got.
You didn't.
But he had a full copy, which later was published. And I remember a British friend phoned me. I was visiting one of my sons in Los Angeles. And he phoned me in the morning, Ted, there is an op-ed piece about you in the New York Times today. And I said, I got scared. There's usually
bad news when somebody phones
when you are
to
in the
say
media, it's
that.
bad
I have
news.
that. I know that.
And he said, no, don't be nervous. It's pretty good for you.
For you, yeah. And it showed that you operated on the basis of principle, they gave the advice, and it clearly wasn't taken. But there were, I mean, you were in the Foreign Office, you were a lawyer there, but you somehow segued into diplomacy. You ended up being an ambassador and had a career as an ambassador. Tell us about it.
Actually, I even today do not understand why I was appointed ambassador.
Well, I have a suggestion, which is that they may have thought, this guy's going to be trouble, let's send him somewhere.
There may have been a point of that. But in any event, it's strange at that time. I never thought when I gave that opinion that it would have an impact on my career in the Foreign Office. I felt that legal advisors are a little bit, you have an expression in the UK which we don't have anywhere else. Legal advisors have been called officers of law.
Officers of the court, officers of law, yeah.
And I think that there is some significance to that. You should call the law for what it is. and not play games with it. We must maintain some kind of integrity and moral values when we interpret legal texts. And I often thought that, I think I have, I don't know, I have something like 12 legal books, but the thing which was more read of me than anything else is 3 typed pages.
Well, yes, your 3 typed pages, which were the advice that you gave in 67, 68, on the 67 on the settlements, has kind of, been the great sort of mark of who this man is, that he gave advice which was being principled and being true to law.
Actually, I followed it up the following year. If one opinion was not enough, with an opinion on whether it was right for the army to destroy on the West Bank houses of inhabitants, Arabs, who were accused of subversive activities. And the second point, the question was, is it all right to deport them? And you can imagine what answers I gave.
And you were very concerned even then about the whole idea of collective punishments and the way in which...
That was the heart of the second opinion.
That's right. Diplomacy, did you enjoy being a diplomat?
Yes.
You did?
Yes.
I bet you were really
It was
good at
very interesting.
Yeah. And then you decided, and I want to know why, really, because I tried to puzzle it in your writing of your memoir, but you really, the thing that you really ached to do was scholarship.
That's right. Actually, when I was in Cambridge, before I accepted an offer from the Israeli Foreign Ministry, I tried to find a teaching position in the smaller British universities, but nobody would take me.
Oh, they're queuing up now, you see?
Nobody,
they're all saying, oh,
nobody's queuing up.
But so you decided that you really wanted to be in the academic world. You really wanted that business.
Well, I really wanted to very much to do human rights scholarship and humanitarian law scholarship. And it just happens that way. When I finished the embassy in Canada, I was given a Rockefeller Foundation fellowship to come to New York for a year and do a book about the United Nations Secretariat. And
not your greatest tome, it has to be said.
Sorry?
Not your greatest tome. I'm going to talk about some of your other books.
Well, this book was actually an extremely progressive book.
No.
It had a chapter about treatment of women in the UN Secretariat.
No, you were a man before your time. There is no doubt about that. But it's true to say that you started going down a route, and I'm going to divert off into Shakespeare in a minute, but you went down a route in which you were writing about how the law was developing and changing. And I think it's important for people to know that when you were invoking the Geneva Convention that was created after the Second World War, the huge change that it was making was saying, we have to learn from the experience of this war. And that was why there was these sort of new positions on, you don't, for the reason of Lebensraum, you don't sort of grab other people's land in order to expand your own people into them, as the Germans had sought to do. But the other thing was...
And as they did in Poland.
And they did in Poland.
For instance, the city where I was born was annexed to Germany.
It was annexed, yeah.
For settlement of native Germans.
Yeah. So you'd seen that up close and seen what that did. But the other thing was that the Geneva Convention created after the war really did lay out, if you like, the rules of war, that civilians required special protections, that you didn't bombard. I mean, that we'd learned from Dresden, from Coventry, that the whole business of just blasting places to smithereens should not be part of war, that hospitals had to be protected, schools had to be protected, and civilians had to be, and that you could only justify bombing places if they were a legitimate military target, and therefore you had to be fairly confident about that.
all of that was in the Geneva Convention that was created after the war, and that was something that mattered to you. And it seems to me that your own experience of the war fed into the things that you were writing about.
There is no question. The war, the experience not just of killing, but total loss of autonomy. You had no say about anything. And after that, my interest in human rights and humanitarian law really were guided by a sense of trying to make a small contribution to a world in which this will not be happening again. And what helped me greatly during all those periods is that very early on, I became involved in activities of various organizations. One of them, with which I'm still involved in various ways, is the International Committee of the Red Cross.
Yes.
And I have been running since the next one in March would be the 43rd annual seminar for UN diplomats, which I'm running with the ICRC. And of course, I was also involved with Human Rights Watch. And one of the things to which I contributed at that time was to persuade Human Rights Watch that they should be concerned not only about human rights which apply more or less in time of peace, but also in humanitarian law. Because
laws of war.
The war's abuses occur in time of war.
Conflict, yeah.
So it all combined, and
I mean, you became your reputation went before you, because any of us who followed human rights law and international law knew you, Ted, and your writing and your work. And you were a professor at NYU, New York University, and would often come to Oxford and so on, and to other universities as a visiting professor. But I've got to deal with the fact that you became a judge. You became this whole shift that took place when you were sort of tapped on the shoulder, and they indicated to you that they were going to create a tribunal, and you had been involved in laws development, and there were those who wanted you to take on the senior role at the tribunal that would try the war crimes in relation to Yugoslavia.
well, the war in Yugoslavia and subsequently the genocidal events in Rwanda were sort of a wake-up call, because they were close to something that really I hoped would never happen again, certainly not on European soil, with regard to.
But you had to change. I mean,
I was. Let me tell you the story. Will you have 1 second? I was a visiting professor at Berkeley. And before that, I had two sort of involvements of reference. There was a famous human rights conference in Copenhagen, I believe in 1990, OSCE, on human dimension.
It was just after the end of the Cold War.
We were really hoping that this is the end.
era.
Glasnost, perestroika, Gorbachev.
A new era.
And a new era, Helsinki Declaration will be the Bible.
9/11 paid to all of that.
Will be the Bible of everybody. And so I realized that you have the combination of the human rights and humanitarian law factors. And I was in Berkeley. And before that, the US sent me as a public member of the delegation to Rome, which wrote the statute of
the Rome Treaty, which created the International Criminal Court.
So that was sort of entry into international criminal law, international humanitarian law. I realized how important it was, and the atrocities in Yugoslavia were terrible. And I was particularly moved by reports on the mass rapes which were being committed. And so I was in Rome and played a role in drafting crimes against humanity and war crimes provisions. And then when I was in Berkeley, the State Department started writing me saying we have a case with Iran oil platforms case, which was something very, very famous. Would you help us? And my wife and I were really very much interested in using our weekends for traveling along this beautiful coast of California, looking at sea lions. And
Big Sur.
Big Sur, exactly. So since they needed those things urgently, I remember I always traveled with a yellow legal pen. And whenever an idea came to mind, I would stop, which drove Monique
mad.
mad. But she would not. She realized I had to do it. And after that, they invited me for a year or so as counsel on international law to the State Department. And in the meantime, the American judge on the ICTY, Patricia Wald, who was much more qualified to be a judge than I was not qualified at all, resigned. And there was an announcement, we are looking for a judge. And I said to myself, well,
maybe
it
I
would be
should.
stupid not to try.
Yes.
Now that I am in the State Department this year, they know me. I was in the Rome conference when the tribunals were being created. I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs entitled "The Case for War Crimes Trials in Yugoslavia."
But you didn't know how political becoming a judge in an international court could become.
And then eventually they had a very serious committee, and they had to present 5 candidates. And I had a unanimous support of the group and became a judge. And I must say, the one thing in my life which I would not have exchanged for anything else was to be on sort of act of creation of modern criminal law.
Yes.
And you had to change all your academic instinct. You cannot have a draft and send it to 25 colleagues for comments. It was a very solitary job.
Yeah.
You could consult, talk to people who were with you in a panel.
Yes.
Up to a point.
But not too many footnotes.
Not too many footnotes. And more than that, you had to divert your attention from a sort of across the entire universe comparison of principles and be laser focused on one case, on law and evidence for one case, and be guided by the fairness of the process, by due process. And if it resulted in an acquittal of a case,
and you had that experience.
on a case which everybody wanted me to convict, it was just too bad.
Yeah, you absolutely did the right thing, but it was sensitive.
Oh, that in a way, some of the worst times which I had in my life followed a reversal of convictions in 1 or 2 cases.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, it was so bad. I was every day in media, and uniformly as the villain.
As a villain.
As the villain. And I really wanted to resign from the court. And my wife said, no, over my dead body. If you do that, people will say that you recognize that you should not have let those people go. You should not have reversed the
But you did the right thing. If the evidence doesn't reach the threshold, then that's it. That's it.
And then I counted recently, because of this memoir, I presided, I was always on the appeals chamber. I was not in the trial chamber. And I think that I had something between 30 and 40 appeals over which I presided as president of the tribunal. And I think they acquitted out of these, reversed the convictions, about 6, which is a reasonable number.
Reasonable, of course.
And in any event, the statistics did not guide me.
I can tell you, Ted Meron, that you are considered in the community of international lawyers as having been a great judge. So you can take that comfort from
This is the one thing that counts to me.
Yes, and it was.
I have good conscience about this period.
Yeah. But you had the experience of having to make an intellectual shift because it's not like being an academic. It is a different way of being when you're sitting as a judge.
It was a complete transformation.
Yeah. Yes.
Thinking of just of one case, no big analogies.
Yes.
No jumping to a law of another country, just the law applicable to this case, the evidence that can be produced.
Now, we're running out of time, but I wanted basically to talk about the fact that you were married and you have 2 lovely sons and grandchildren now. Your first marriage didn't last, but you met this incredible woman. And I'm going to talk about your long, long marriage, which was to Monique. And it was a great love affair.
Oh, it was amazing.
Yeah. And I mean, you really did have the most amazing relationship. And she was the person who took you on a diversion, which was into Shakespeare. And so you've written a number of your books. I mean, that's why I was teasing you about your book about the UN and the Secretariat. But you've written a number of books about the law and Shakespeare.
But did I tell you how she became interested in Shakespeare?
No.
I was visiting fellow at All Souls. And at that time, that was 89, I came back as a visiting fellow in 91. At that time, All Souls was not very fond of having women around.
Now, who would have thought such a thing? What a terrible thought.
So it became clear after a while that she can come for, she would be welcome for dinner once a term. And when I invited her for tea, some people were making faces. So I would ask for tea to be brought to my study. And because I was very busy and she could not be too much, show her face too much in All Souls, she took courses. And courses at that time, do they require identification now to enter into seminars? I don't know, but at that time they did not. So she took a seminar or course on Shakespeare.
She did Oxford without people knowing that she was doing Oxford.
on Shakespeare, and one day she came and said, Ted, you are supposed to be interested or an expert on law of war and humanitarian law. We dealt today with Henry V, and Fluellen says in Henry V, it is against the law of arms to kill the boys in the luggage. And the instructor made fun of that and said he was prescient. He knew how luggage one day will be
property
will be dealt with in Heathrow. But she persuaded me that I should be interested in that, and I said my knowledge of Shakespeare is high school Macbeth. Mostly in Hebrew. So, in any event, eventually she persuaded me.
I once defended Lady Macbeth, I just want you to know.
And my dedication to her on the first Shakespeare book, which was OUP, was her idea. And on the second, she made me love him.
And you fell in love with Shakespeare, and as you both did, and you've written a number of books, and so I recommend them to you. Ted, you've sadly lost Monique a few years ago, and it's been a great pain to you, hasn't it, the loss? But you have the pleasure of knowing that you had a marvelous life together.
Yes, but the problem with great relationships is that when they end, you pay a heavy price.
Yeah, the price of love is loss. Yeah. Now, I'm going to ask this audience if they've got any questions for you, and I bet they have, and there are microphones, and I'm sure that people can run down the side with them. I'm keeping an eye on our time.
Apparently, I was so clear there are no questions.
No, there are definitely going to be questions. I mean, one of the things one of the parts of your book that I really was so interested in was what you called Against a Narrative of Guilt, and the acquittal of General Gotovina.
that was hard because it was running against a tide that was wanting his conviction, and yet you had to rely strictly on what evidence there was, and did it reach the standard of proof, and so on.
That was, these were in a way the most difficult days I have ever lived, because the entire media made me the villain. If a prosecutor, if an international prosecutor produces an indictment and charges, how can this Ted Meron not follow them?
Well, because the evidence that you need for a warrant, the standard of proof to apply and for a court to grant a warrant is lower than for conviction and taking someone's liberty away. I mean, those are things that we as lawyers know.
I mean, if you are in deal with other subjects, but international criminal lawyers, especially presidents of people who preside over appeals chambers, realize that they deal with liberty and life of families, because if you convict somebody to prison, the family is collateral damage also. And eventually, you know, I spoke in my memoir often about the factor of luck. The factor of luck here was that this question of acquittal of Gotovina eventually came up before the principal judicial organ of the UN, which unanimously agreed with me.
Yes. No, I mean, it was an issue around the quality of evidence. Now,
Helena, there's a question over here.
oh, great, good. We want a question, and you'll start it all off.
Thank you very, very much for your talk today. You mentioned that there's often an overlap between the political and the legal spheres, and often political voices have a lot of influence on decisions in court. I was wondering, since the creation of the UN at the start, there's been a huge influence of certain countries, the P5 countries, on legal and international law decisions. I was wondering if you've noticed over your career if there's been a move towards including more different countries and their voices on international
expanding
tribunals.
the Security Council. You know, should it be that? I mean, reflecting on your long career, do you think that the politicization of some of the court?
One of the perhaps my lodestars as a judge was that you have a very narrow mandate. You have a very narrow remit. And bodies which deal with international justice, which are not judicial, have a much greater scope of taking into consideration other types of goals, of agendas. But the judge must have a very narrow agenda, as his agenda is focused on a particular case and exclusion of goals which otherwise we would all consider desirable. You should not take anything into account, anything extraneous, and that includes political considerations. And I respect for that, and at times it made for a very unpleasant few months, but you have to, if you cannot take the heat, don't stay in the kitchen.
Ted, you and I are at the moment facing this discomfort of the possibility of being sanctioned by President Trump. And I just wanted to talk about that work that we did together, because we were asked to be a second set of eyes. There were 6 lawyers. We were basically British-based because it was a much more convenient thing to have people who were close to The Hague and who were all known to the, you know, at least had some interaction with the court. And we were asked to be a second set of eyes to look at the evidence to see if it passed the threshold for an application for a warrant. I mean, really, because the anticipation was that this would be scrutinized greatly, given that it was a concerning.
We assumed that.
Yes, we assumed that in advance. And so we were asked, was it something that you were enthusiastic to do?
Well, when I was first appointed assistant on international humanitarian law by the prosecutor, I told him that I do it, I accept on one condition, that I will recuse myself for anything having to do
With Israel.
with Israel, Palestine, and everything. And then I was...
It was too raw for you.
it was borderline appropriate. And then I was that was during our Easter break in Oxford, and I was giving a seminar at NYU in New York, and the prosecutor called me and said, "Do you still insist on your recusal, because you could really help us in this group?" And I told him that I wish he would not have approached me, because it's too raw, too close. But once he did approach me, I felt that for a person who spent 2 decades on UN war crimes tribunals, it would be somewhat hypocritical when it's close to him that he says, "No, I will pass this one," which would have been safer.
Yeah.
But so I decided to do it.
But it's clearly not understood by people that the purpose and role of the panel, the 6 of us, a Lord Justice of Appeal, recently retired, Lord Justice Adrian Fulford. There was Elizabeth Wilmshurst, who'd been the second most senior government lawyer in the Foreign Office, Deputy Legal Advisor in the Foreign Office, but now retired from that. There were 2 practitioners from the English bar, myself and Daniel Friedman, a Jewish lawyer, and Amal Clooney, a very distinguished international lawyer, and yourself. And that was it. Have I left anybody out? I think that's it, the 6 of us. And we worked very closely together and very assiduously, and there were certain things that we batted back. And there were other things.
Actually, you and I were usually on the same wavelength.
We were on the same wavelength. We really were. I mean, partly because I've always respected the fact that you've always understood the business about sexual violence in conflict as well. And we saw that in relation to Hamas.
One particular case, I know we are running out of time, of which I am particularly proud, was the first appeals case I had, which was called Kunarak, where we reformed basically the international prohibitions on rape.
On rape, yeah. I know. You are a great man, Ted Meron. You are, and Trinity is proud of your belonging and being part of this family. I'm proud to have had the opportunity of working with you, which I'd always dreamed of doing.
And I'm proud of you talking to me.
And if Trump sanctions us, I'll be proud to be sanctioned with you.